Welcome back to video number 6 in the Helm Mini Course for YouTube. If you're following along, we're slowly working through the process of overriding the default values in a chart. And in the previous video, we did that on the command line, which is okay if you've got just a small number of values, but far more likely you're going to be working with a full file called values.yaml. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to work with that file and actually how to work out what you need to do in that file, which is probably the hardest bit. As you probably know by now, this is an extract from a full Kubernetes course available at Udemy and Virtual Pair Programmers. There's a full link in the description below. We're in the middle of learning how to customize a Helm chart by supplying our own values. So far, we've done the very simple job of installing a chart for a full monitoring stack, part of which is Grafana. And you'll remember that previously we used the command line to override a predefined value. And we worked out, using our powers of investigation, that we could set this value called grafana.admin password. And that was a pretty simple job to do using the Helm upgrade command. The big annoyance in the previous videos, and I'm sure you shared my annoyance here, is that every time we do anything with that Helm chart, I'll just rerun the Helm upgrade command again. Once that's run through, it won't have done anything useful to us because we haven't actually changed the admin password here. But as you know, if we do a kubectl get svc, it will reset all of the other values back to their defaults. And that's causing us a real pain in the neck because our monitoring Grafana service that we're accessing through the browser, every time we make a change, it's snapping back to the default, which is of type cluster IP, which, as you know, means we can't easily access that through a browser. Now, clearly, what we need to do here is we need to override that value as well. We need to somehow configure the chart so that instead of cluster IP, it defaults to node type, and we also need to pass in our specific port number, our node port number of 30,001. How do we do that? I hope you'll understand that on this course, I'm not trying to just give you answers and telling you to do this and do that. The whole point of these videos is to show you how you can work these things out for yourself. Because of course, when you're doing this Helm chart on your projects, you're going to be needing to configure other values and you're going to need to work out what those values are. So in this video, I'm going to partially look at how we could work out how to change this type and the port number. And I would think the starting point for this is the values.yaml file that we created in a previous video. Just to remind you, we did that in a previous video using the Helm show values command. And I really do think this is probably certainly one of the most useful commands that exists in the whole of Helm. And that's what we use to generate this pretty big values.yaml file. Here it is in the text editor, and these are all of the default key value pairs that this particular chart is using. Now, there is an unfortunate problem here, and I'll cut a long story short. I've gone through the pain off camera of searching through this file, all 2,500 lines of it, to see if there's any reference to the service type for Grafana or the node port number. Now, of course, I've done that by basically searching for the word service. Well, unfortunately, there are 129 matches to that, so it's perhaps not that useful. I mean, just as an example, I've landed here on a random block of YAML, and this sounds quite possible. Look, we have service there, and we have cluster IP, and there's some reference to some ports, including a node port, so that might be useful. But you need to get used to this. Remember, these values files are hierarchical. We saw that previously. In this case, the comment is helpful. The comment is telling us that, oh no, this is the configuration for the Alert Manager service, which has got nothing to do with what we're working with here. Now, that's thankfully, whoever developed this chart is a good developer and they've put in a useful comment there. But we could have worked that out if we'd gone a little further up. It's probably going to be quite a lot further. I'm just looking for the parent elements here. Of course, you could use a graphical YAML editor to work this out as well. I've got to go quite a long way up to line 118, and that confirms that actually those values we could see were part of the Alert Manager configuration. So what I would do if I was trying to work this out for myself on a stressful project, I would probably look for the configuration specific to Grafana. So I'll do a search instead for Grafana and colon. And I think that's pretty crucial because that narrows the search down to the specific block where the parent element is Grafana. So I'm hoping that maybe in here, in this block, there is the default values for the service configuration. And this is where things get a little bit disappointing. It doesn't take long. I did a quick video edit there, but it really wasn't much. It didn't take me long to find that there is indeed a block here for the service configuration for Grafana. But here's the disappointment, and it's a little bit hard for me to explain right now until we've gone a little further. When we get towards the end of these videos, I'm going to show you how you can develop your own charts from scratch and why that's a useful thing to do, a very useful thing to do. But until we've learned how to do that, it's kind of hard for me to explain that really all of these values are just defined or just invented by whoever wrote the chart. And it's entirely up to them how they do things. So that means that whatever the configuration value that allows us to change the type of this service, that developer could have called the parameter port type. They could have called it just type. They could have called it service port type. We don't know. It's entirely down to the developer of the chart. In other words, there's no particular standard here. And also, as you can see, you might have been expecting whatever that default value is, you might have been expecting it to appear here in the values.yaml file. But actually it doesn't have to, and that's because in this case, in this particular case, whoever developed the chart has hard-coded into that chart. If there is no value appearing here in the values.yaml file, they use a hard-coded default value. As I say, I'll be able to explain that properly a little bit later on. For now, it's just, sorry, we're out of luck. It could be that the port type is configured using a port type field where we could plug in node ports. Or it could be that the developer of the chart has called it type. Or it could be service port type. Or it could be, and I hope you get the point here, it could be something else. It could be they have a field called node port, and if we set the value to yes, then it will give us a node port instead. All of this is entirely the choice of the developer of the chart. Now, as I say, when we get to that later video, we will look at the implementation of the chart and we'll be able to see exactly what parameter they've used. But that's coming up a little bit later. For now, I would just say, if the chart is a good chart, then there will be documentation online for the chart. So with a little searching, I'm here on the GitHub repository for the Grafana Helm chart. This Prometheus stack that we're using here, in fact, just uses the Grafana Helm chart. I'll just scroll straight down to this section here on their GitHub page. And very helpfully, they have a configuration section. And they're giving you here a very digestible list of all of the major values that you can tune. And they're also telling you what they've coded in as the default. So if you're stuck with a chart and you need to know how to configure it, I'd say there are two main ways of working it out. And the easiest way, if it's available, is to use the user guide for that chart, if the developers have been conscientious enough to actually provide one. And in the case of Grafana, they have. Failing that, the second option will be to look at the implementation of the chart, and we'll do that a little bit later on. But we're okay here. We're okay with Grafana, I think anyway. If we go a little further down, and there we go, we don't need to go too far, we can see here that they have provided a service.type field, which defaults, to cluster IP. That's why it's resetting every time we redeploy this chart. And the other field we will need is the service.node port. Perfect, exactly what we need. And the default is nil because, of course, it's not needed if it's of type cluster IP. We do need it, and therefore we can override it. So that means then what we could do, if I recall my command of Helm upgrade, we could now go ahead and go on with further -- sets. We could set grafana.service.type equals node port, and I could go on to do the other parameters, but now to get to the main point of this video, you can see that this is starting to get pretty tedious, a great big long command line with all these -- sets. What we can do instead is we can provide all of that configuration in the values.yaml file itself. Previously, we just used this values.yaml file as a kind of almost a reference guide. We used it, for instance, to find out that the admin password was a particular value. But this values.yaml file can also be passed in to the install and the upgrade command to override the default values of this chart. So what we can absolutely do is we can get rid of all of these comments now, and we know now that the name of the parameter is type. This is a child of service, which is itself is a child of Grafana. We can set the type to node port. And just to remember, the other parameter is node port, and we can set that to any value. Now, just so we're absolutely sure that this is working, I'm going to use a different value this time. I'm going to go for something we've never used before. Let's go for randomly 30,008. And tell you what, while we're here, we could also go up to it's near the top of this block on line 628. We can also now firm up that we always want the admin password to be admin. So that means now this file contains all of the configuration that we want. And what we can now do, if I go back to that Helm upgrade command, I'll remove all of those -- sets. Instead of -- sets, we can now use -- values equals, and then refer to that file. That file can be called anything you like, but as you'll see a little later on when we work with the full chart, it's kind of standard to call this file values.yaml. So let's try that and see what happens. As before, we have those very annoying warnings. Yes, it has done an upgrade and we are in the status of deployed. And we'll be able to see very quickly if those values have worked by doing a kubectl get svc. And fantastic! We do have a node port, and it is that random value we set of 30,008, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, if you've been following along and for any reason this isn't working for you, then it's definitely the hardest thing with working with these values is, as we saw previously, you'll remember I made an error with the admin password. It's essential that you get these values correct and at the correct point in the hierarchy. So make sure you've been working in the correct service block. That needs to be a child of Grafana, and make sure you've got all of these fields correct. So obviously there are thousands of other values in here, but actually all of these are the defaults that came with the charts. It's entirely up to you, but you don't actually need any of those other values because they are the defaults. So although we generated this values.yaml file to show you all of the 2,500 lines that are making this configuration, you could perfectly well get rid of all of the things that you don't need. So I'll do a little bit of editing here. It is going to be essential that we leave the Grafana parent tag in place, but apart from that, we can get rid of everything apart from the admin password field and the service block that we've just overridden. But then apart from that, everything below it can go. And everything above it can go as well. So we're left with just this very much smaller file. Now, I generated this values YAML file really for illustration to show you those defaults. In practice, we'd have probably have come at this from the other direction. We'd have determined that we wanted to override just these two fields, so we would have probably built this file from scratch. It's entirely up to you. Let's check this, and to check it, I think we'll switch back to the previous node port of 30,001, and we'll run the upgrade command again. And we're deployed at revision 5. So what's happened to our service? Here's the node port, and wonderful, we are now on port 30,001. Although you can use --set on the command line, you would only use that in a few very minor situations, really. Probably if you're just playing with a new chart and you're wanting to try a few values and you can't be bothered to create a values.yaml file, but pretty soon you'll find that's far too tedious and you're almost certainly going to be using your own custom values.yaml file. I hope that's been helpful, and what I've been trying to do here is trying to show you how you would work out these fields rather than me just telling you, because of course when you're working on some charts you'll be working with very different values. I've only really given you half the story so far though. Really, we appealed to the user guide here, and we were lucky that there was a good user guide for Grafana. Lots of charts don't have good user guides though, so what we could have done is we could have looked at the source code for this chart. That sounds a bit scary, but we'll learn how to do that when we actually learn how to build some charts. That's coming up in a few videos' time. Before then, I'd like to talk about snowflake clusters and how to avoid them, and we'll do that in the next video.